The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. When my little brother Jerry got married, I was asked to step in as a bridesmaid for his wife-to-be. The guest list was a little thin on the bride's side, and he figured it'd be a good bonding experience. His fiancée, Susie, came from a small rural community back in Minnesota and didn't have a lot of family. Jerry had briefly mentioned that she was an orphan and that it was sort of an off-limit topic to bring up. Not that I'd planned to. Susie and Jerry had met during his studies at MSU, and they'd been together for over 6 years before they made it official. These were two people who were more or less married already. On their wedding day, I tried my best to cater to Susie's needs. She seemed a bit down, but I figured it was just cold feet. I didn't want to pressure her, so I held my tongue and observed. There were a lot of little things that stood out to me. The way she sighed at her reflection, the way her eyes sunk when she saw the flower arrangements. She didn't say anything, but there was a sort of lulling discontent on her face. As we waited for the dress, I found her pouting on an ottoman outside the bathroom. I joined her, giving her a curious look. "It's all beautiful," I assured her. "All of it. I can tell you put a lot of thought into it." "It's not a big deal," she smiled, "but it's not perfect. I mean, nothing is, but you know." "I get it, yeah," I nodded. "Nothing's perfect." "It's not that, it's like..." She turned in her seat, facing me with a furrowed brow. "Nothing is really truly beautiful. It's all right, but nothing is like I want it to be." "What would you change then?" I asked. "If you had more time?" "That's just the thing," she groaned. "I have no idea. It's just a feeling, you know." There were a couple of surprises for Susie, though. Jerry had gone out of his way to make her happy. He had managed to track down her mother's wedding dress, something that had been put up for auction years ago when some of the family's estate was sold off to pay for Susie's education. He'd also made a bridal bouquet from the vivid pink flowers that grew in the backyard of her childhood home. These were all surprises, but he had backups on backups if she didn't like them, green flags all around. When the dress arrived, Susie got this strange expression on her face, like recognition, disbelief, and amazement all rolled into one. She cracked a smile and twirled around the room with it, hugging it like an old friend. It was certainly unique, an old-fashioned blend between a drop waist and empire cut. She held the dress up and stared at a mirror, speaking to me without looking away. "It's not perfect, but it's getting there," she smiled. "It's almost like I picture it. I feel it." I handed her the bridal bouquet, watching the blue petals reflect in her eyes. "I really do feel it right here." She put her hand on her stomach, smiling from ear to ear. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The walk down the aisle, the exchanging of vows. They walked out of the church to a church organ rendition of Tom Jones's Chills and Fever. That was also the first dance they shared at the reception. While my focus was on Jerry, I couldn't help but to look over at Susie every now and then. I caught her looking at her reflection a couple of times. She'd peer over the counter of the open bar and stare at herself in the mirror wall. I also noticed a bit of hesitance to throw the bridal bouquet. She couldn't keep her eyes off the blue petals. It's like she was mesmerized and wanted to keep it to herself. All in all, it turned into a good night. Lots of laughs, drinks, and dancing, but I couldn't help but to notice something strange in Susie's eyes, a light that wasn't there earlier that day. A couple of days turned into weeks and life went on. I forgot about Susie and her wedding dress. That is, until Jerry called me up. He wanted to have lunch and catch up. Jerry and I have always had a good relationship, but we didn't really spend time on our own. We mostly just met for big events. To have him willingly seek me out rang some alarm bells. I met him at a cafe downtown. I had a sandwich. He got nothing, not even coffee. I could tell he was trying to keep a brave face, but there were worrying signs. I caught him yawning, and he had a slight shake to his hands. Something was clearly bothering him. I tried to get a read of him with some small talk, but it wasn't long until the conversation took a turn. "I want to talk about the wedding," he said. "Did Susie say something when she saw that dress?" "She loved it," I said, chewing on my sandwich. "Really loved it." "Yeah, but did she say anything? Anything strange?" "She mentioned it not being perfect," I nodded. "But getting there, you know? Getting there." "Yeah, like..." I shrugged. I didn't know how to explain it. In fact, as I looked back on it, I had no idea what she meant. It felt like an off-the-shoulder comment, but maybe there was more to it. Jerry held his hands up. "Look," he sighed, "we've been having issues." Turns out their honeymoon didn't turn out as magical as one was led to believe. Susie had been obsessing over that wedding dress all week long. Jerry had once walked in on her wearing it in the bathroom, crying over how she wouldn't get a chance to wear it again. She said it made her feel beautiful, he explained, and how rare that was. Not wanting to see her sad on the first week of their life together, Jerry had just gone along with whatever Susie asked of him. She'd been wearing that dress pretty much all day long, even sleeping in it a couple of nights. For passers-by, it had been an amusing oddity, but Jerry was getting worried. Susie was having trouble keeping it together, and ever since they got back home, her behavior had taken a turn for the worse. Jerry had trouble talking about it. He kept touching his face, as if trying to hide what he was saying. He'd find Susie getting up at night to put the dress on, twisting and turning in front of the mirror to see herself at different angles. But it was more than just the dress. She'd begun making modifications. The dress wasn't perfect, and she was obsessed with this idea of making it what it could be. It started with hand-weaving a couple of blue threads into the edges of the dress, but lately she'd turned to accessorizing, turning away from the dress and onto herself. The perfect makeup, the right shade of nail polish, that kind of thing, Jerry explained. "I've seen her looking up tattoo places around town. I don't know what to say." "Look, you married her," I smiled. "In sickness and health. Just be there for her, Jerry." "I'm all about that," he nodded. "But this ain't normal, and I don't know where it's going to stop." Jerry leaned back, dragging his hands across his face. "She scares me." I got a couple of updates over the next few days. Susie had changed her hair, her nails, and she was wearing her makeup in an unusual way. Jerry had trouble explaining it. He had managed to dissuade her from getting her face tattooed, but just a day later, he had to stop her again, this time from scarring her own face with a nail clipper. It was getting serious. We texted back and forth, trying to figure out what to do and who to talk to. It was obvious that Susie was having trouble that we couldn't begin to understand. Something had just snapped when she put that dress on, the same dress she'd obsessed over all her life, the one exactly like the one her mother had worn. Which got me thinking, what had really happened to her parents? Not even Jerry knew. It was the one thing that Susie refused to talk about. Then Jerry stopped responding. It was sudden, so I decided to pay him a visit. In all the years that he and Susie had been together, I'd never heard of them having this kind of issue before. I had no idea what to expect. These two were like the baseline picture of what a healthy relationship should look like, and all of a sudden, it had just collapsed. I drove by their home, a row house in a calm residential area. It didn't take long to see that something was wrong. There were neighbors outside and a squad car on the driveway. People were about to scatter back to where they came from, leaving only Jerry and 2 police officers. They were finishing up as I approached. I caught the glimpse of a conversation ending with Jerry being asked to reconsider something, and that was that. The moment I approached, he gave me a hug. I'd never been hugged like that before, like he was holding on for dear life. He peered inside his home, as if checking for Susie, and told me the story with a hushed tone. Susie had gone off the rails. She'd torn out chunks of her hair and chewed dirt to stain her mouth with the right color. The final straw had been trying to staple her ears to the side of her head, and that's where Jerry had intervened. Things had gone from bad to worse. "She says I'm keeping her from perfection," he said. She says I'm holding her back." Susie had attacked him, thrown things, screamed, broken furniture. She had wreaked havoc on their home, completely remorseless. That's why the police were there. The neighbors had called them. But instead of pressing charges, Jerry had dismissed them. He was going to get Susie help personally. He didn't want her to end up in a cell. She needed treatment, and he needed my help to move her. As we stepped inside their home, I could tell it hadn't been a little spat. There was broken glass strewn across the floor, a broken chair, and every painting had been thrown across the room. Susie was sitting on the living room couch in what remained of her torn wedding dress. It had been stained with patches of green, brown, and blue. She had large red bald patches on her head, and she'd applied all kinds of makeup seemingly at random. She was slowly dancing with her arms, like she was playing an invisible harp. She said something about her movements being part of her new aesthetic, Jerry explained. She's been like that for the past 20 minutes or so. I took a few steps closer, making sure not to interrupt her movements. They were choppy and artificial, like a buffering video. She had one eye fixed on her hands, and the other eye moving at random. It was impossible to tell if she was paying attention to us. If I hadn't known it was her, there'd be no way to recognize her. Apart from all the things she'd done to herself, she'd also lost a lot of weight. Still, she seemed happy. Maybe even happier than she'd been at the wedding. Jerry moved up behind her and slowly put his hands around her torso. With a little nudging, she got the message and stood up, careful not to miss any arm movements. I moved ahead, making sure there was nothing in the way. It felt like moving a glass figurine. We had no idea what could break her. We managed to get her in the car. Jerry asked me to follow in my own car, but I refused. I didn't want to leave him alone with her, especially not going down a highway. I ended up behind the wheel as Jerry and Susie stayed in the back seat. He had a place in mind, one he'd been in contact with over the past week or so. They were mostly for emergencies, but there'd been nothing but luck keeping this breakdown from causing serious damage. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if she'd been in the kitchen, by the knives. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I suddenly heard a snap, then another. Looking over, I saw Susie furiously pulling at her fingers, almost tearing them out of their sockets. Jerry threw himself at her. No, she cried. They need to be the same length. They need to be the same. By the time we got to the address Jerry had given me, the back seat was pandemonium. Susie was screeching like an animal, scratching and tearing at Jerry to get away. I saw two men running out of a nearby building to help us. A door opened, and Susie was grabbed. She screamed at them to let her go, to let her fix her fingers, and Jerry screamed back. I barely understood what happened until I was alone in the car, watching Jerry and two men in white uniforms take Susie away. A couple minutes later, I got a text saying I was good to go, and a thank you. Coming home later that night, I took a long look at myself in the mirror. I tried my best to figure out what Susie was obsessing about, but there was no logic to it. Sure, I have my flaws, and she did too, but whatever she was doing wasn't helping. What kind of ideal was she really pursuing? I talked to Jerry just before I went to bed. Susie was in good hands for the time being, and he was at home, sleeping alone for the first time in years. I could tell it was bothering him. I don't know what she's looking for, he sighed. It's like she wants something perfect, but she just destroys herself. Maybe she's got another idea of what's perfect and what isn't, I said. Maybe, yeah, he agreed. But some of the stuff she says, it's not just changing your nails or your hair. She says things sometimes when she thinks I don't hear. Like what? Like? He took a deep breath. I could tell he was in the bathroom. Had he been crying? Like she's wishing for more arms, or to be taller, or to be transparent. Things were quiet for a couple of days after. I reached out to Jerry, but I didn't get a lot back. A quick text every now and then to tell me he was doing okay. Susie was getting the help she needed, but she wasn't improving. At least we'd stopped her from getting worse. I thought about it a lot. Everything had changed the moment she saw that dress. Sure, it had been unique, but what was so special about it? I asked Jerry's permission to ask around and show a few pictures of it. There were also a few cuts that Susie had discarded, which I could use to show off the fabric. I talked to a couple of professionals around town. Most of them didn't have a lot to say or dismissed me entirely. It took me half a day before I found this old woman at a hidden-away private tailor downtown that I could get some answers. They were about to close, but she took some time out of her day to help. She had never seen that cut before, despite having worked with wedding dresses for close to 40 years. It had to be a custom job, but what seemed to vex her the most was the fabric. It's not Charmeuse or Georgette, she pondered. A sateen blend. No. She compared it to a couple of her own fabric samples, but came up with nothing. We were about to give up when she caught a glimpse of her husband having a cigarette outside. She got an idea and asked my permission to set the fabric on fire. Apparently, that's a way you can get a rough idea about the nature of the textile. Now, this piece of fabric was just a small square, no bigger than the palm of my hand, but she borrowed her husband's lighter, put the square down, and set it on fire. The reaction was immediate. It bulged in the middle as a dozen little branch-like extremities poked out of it. They grew, twisting and turning like a dying snake. The fabric turned from a bright white to a dark blue with a metallic sheen. The branches grew thicker, reaching further and further out, morphing into a petal-like flat surface. By the time the whole square was consumed by fire, it had spread out like a chemical grenade had gone off. At a distance, it was almost pretty, like a blue sunflower. She didn't have the slightest idea what it was supposed to be. The only thing she knew was that she wanted it out of her store, and that she needed to wipe down every surface it had touched with chlorine. I had the image of that fabric twisting and turning under the flames in my head for a couple of days. It was something animalistic about it, like a living, breathing thing. I thought about calling up Jerry to ask for more scraps that I could ask someone else about, maybe a chemist, but I didn't get the opportunity. It was a Thursday around 2 a.m. Jerry called me, breathing heavily into the phone. He'd been running. Apparently there was an issue with Susie. She'd gotten out, and they needed people to help find her. That's all he knew. There was no question about it. Of course I was going to help. I met up with Jerry and made my way out to the mental health facility we'd dropped her off at. We drove past the sign with the Hatchet corporate logo and got stopped at the entrance by an armed guard. Jerry explained that we were there to help with the search, and we were let in. We were to take a detour from the main entrance, though, so I only caught a glimpse of what was happening in there. Whatever Susie had done, it was big news. 2 ambulances, several police vehicles, and about half a dozen unmarked black vehicles. They didn't even have license plates. I think I spotted something splayed out on the asphalt on stretchers, either wounded people or dead. We were guided to the staff parking lot around the back. A handful of other vehicles were parked, and about 24 people surrounding them, mostly volunteer staff. They were handing out search locations, shouting out rules, and telling people who to pair up with and how. But Jerry wasn't having it. In the flashing red and blue lights, I could tell he was having second thoughts. He turned to me and lowered his voice. "I don't think she'd just run into the woods," he said. "I think she's going home." "Then why didn't you stay home?" "Not our home," he said, shaking his head. "The place where she feels most home." There was a secret picnic spot not too far from there. It was where Jerry had proposed. A large field, covered in flowers, with a single 4-bench picnic table that had been overgrown since the early 90s. The place was abandoned, but it was one of Susie's favorite spots in the world. And maybe it was just a hunch, but that's where Jerry felt that she was going. All this talk of beauty might have gotten him thinking about it. We had to go off-road and park on a slope, walking up a hill in the dark. There was a full moon out, but the light was covered in a spotty cloud cover. The sky was passing so fast that you felt like you were moving even when standing still. We made our way through an overgrown trail, past a dense pine forest, and saw the woods open into a clearing. And there she was. I saw her from about 200 feet away, standing on a picnic table, staring at the moon. She'd gotten her dress back, but it was torn and disheveled beyond repair. It had gone from a majestic wedding dress to something that barely covered her knees. It was torn, dirty, frayed and bloody, much like Susie herself. She barely had any hair left. Her eyes were sunken into her head, making her whole face seem smaller. Her chapped lips were drawn back into a permanent half-smile, straining against the shape of her cranium. Her fingers were broken and bruised, and she stood on the tip of her toes, doing a balancing act as she slowly moved her arms around. All without rhythm, rhyme, or reason. This was beyond a pattern. It was surreal, and the image has seared into my head. It still comes to mind when I catch some abstract dance number on TikTok, and when it does, it gives me chills. But that night I didn't just have chills, I was scared. I'd seen a lot of things in my life up until that point, but there was just something unreal about this. It wasn't just madness, it was commitment. Susie knew something we didn't. We approached her slowly. As we got closer, her head turned to us, her eyes darting between me and Jerry. They seemed to move independently of one another. I could see a crack in the corner of her mouth as her involuntary smile twisted into a full-grown grin. "Susie, we gotta go home," Jerry pleaded. "I don't want you getting hurt." She turned her back on him, looking out into the fields beyond. Whatever she saw, there was something far more interesting than what I and Jerry could offer. Still, he didn't give up. He begged her to step down from the table and come to him. He talked about the adventures they'd had and the challenges they'd overcome. And yet, Susie didn't budge. I wasn't really paying attention to what Jerry was saying. I was looking the same way as Susie. What was she really seeing? Was there something there? You know the way a ray of light can catch your eye, a reflection off a piece of jewelry or a watch, and how it can sting your eye out of nowhere. That's how I felt. I followed Susie's eyes, and I saw something. Not in the night sky, but in the tree line on the other side of the glade. Looking at it stung me. It burned. It was uncomfortable, much like a ray of unwanted sun. I recoiled and regained my balance. Jerry stopped in his tracks, looking over at me. I nodded that I was fine. He looked back at Susie, but I tapped him on the shoulder. He turned his attention back to me. "Don't look," I wheezed. "Don't look." But it was impossible not to. Although it burned me, I couldn't help but to look. There was something moving towards us. I couldn't see a shape, because it had none. It was like looking at an uncomfortable feeling and having it bury into your head. I could only look at it in short bursts, but I still couldn't help myself. Susie, on the other hand, was staring at it. She didn't dare close her eyes. As her hand movements relaxed and slowed, I saw her shoulder slump. "They think I'm beautiful," she cried. "They'll make me perfect." "Susie, what are you—" "They can help you too," she sniffled. "We can both go." Then she turned to us, her eyes trembling like a cold dog. She smiled at me with missing teeth, revealing a bloody tongue. Her left eye found me. "You too," she said. You can come too." Jerry not only stopped, but stepped back. He could feel it too. We were being threatened. There was no way Susie could overpower us both. But that wouldn't matter. She wasn't the threat here, and we didn't even understand what was. But looking across the field, I could tell it was coming closer, leaving a trail of flattened grass as it beelined towards us. "Come on, Jerry," she laughed. "Hurry!" He fell backwards, covering his face with his hands. Something in me told me that I ought to do the same, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to Susie. Whatever was moving out there had reached her, looming over her like a storm cloud. I could feel it. The longer I looked at it, the more complex the sensation. At first it was like a burning pain behind the eyes, leaving a cold and exposed nerve. That nerve tingled with a resonance, painting pictures in my mind like a seismograph. It was happening faster and faster, leaving only fleeting impressions of a being. It had arms longer than bone and skin. It knew words that gave way to thought. It was perfect, beautiful and real, maybe the realest thing I'd ever felt. A transcendent something that had gone past the physical and the immediate, instead surviving as an ideal, as the most beautiful thing you could imagine, fleeting, ever-changing, ever-inviting, and impossible to put into form. This was what Susie had been chasing. She had made herself a mockery in an attempt to create something that couldn't be, and it had recognized her efforts. Looking at Susie for one final time, she screamed with ecstatic joy, and in the blink of an eye, it happened. Her flesh unraveled into a transparent jelly. Her arms bent, snapped, and unfurled into frayed knots, eyes glowing a pure white as her tongue boiled behind crackling teeth. I saw her head twist like a balloon in a storm as her spine left her body. And she laughed. She laughed and cheered to the very end, overjoyed as to come what may. Then she was just gone, dress and all, leaving nothing but a spatter of sizzling stains on the edge of the picnic table. Something turned to me. Even without looking at it, I could feel it looking. Despite everything in me screaming to look away and to deny, there was a part of me that was drawn in by what I'd seen in Susie. Her joy was as pure could get. I wanted to accept it, to explore it. The picture in my mind was growing clearer, and I remember feeling this unearthly sense of peace. I didn't just belong, I was meant to be, and I was beautiful. But luckily Jerry was there. He dragged me down, screaming at me to snap out of it. I hadn't even noticed it, but I was laughing. I had been staring at my hands as if they held some kind of answer. What was I doing? Realizing how close I'd been to losing control, I just hugged my brother and cried. He was inconsolable. We could barely form words as whatever presence we'd felt dissipated, leaving us alone in the dirt, ugly, imperfect, and ourselves. Over the weeks to come, we'd get a bit more context as to what had happened. 2 caretakers had mysteriously disappeared, and a third had been found dead in the break room. The death was described as an accident, but from what eyewitnesses have been telling me, he died in a way that can only be described as a man going through a full-body microwaving. Susie, well, she was just reported missing. What else was there to say? There was no sign of her, and Jerry couldn't very well say that she evaporated. Instead, he was tortured for weeks, asked to keep his chin up, and getting constant reminders that hope was always the last thing to die. They didn't know any better. They didn't know that hope died with a laugh. I think back on that night a lot. I wish it had had a face. I wish I could visualize this singular thing, to put into words what this looked like. But it's impossible. There are no words to describe it. Sometimes in the shower, I try to make up new words for it. They come naturally to me, but I sound completely mad. Nowadays, when I look in the mirror, I don't really see flaws. Not like I used to. I don't see my nose as a little crooked, or my teeth as a little yellow. No, it's bigger than that. It's the sense of being stuck in something static and unchanging, confined. I find myself dreaming of being this cosmic jellyfish, floating formlessly through nothing, barely held together by anything but vague remains of what I was supposed to be. I'm sorry, it's strange. It's really, really strange. And so ungodly beautiful. I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of my life. I've transported everything, from legitimate goods to drugs to guns. I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of life, and I thought I saw it all. None of the strange cargo I've ever ferried, however, can compare to working for Dr. Barrett. I found out about Dr. Barrett while having drinks with other truckers. The man was said to be strange, and his jobs were even stranger. One of my colleagues spent a couple weeks hauling pallets of medicine from the middle of the forest to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Another would ferry nervous workmen in the company of armed guards from the city center to the middle of the steppe. Dr. Barrett was a strange man with strange jobs, but he paid in cash. When my colleagues told me he was looking for a long-haul driver, I didn't hesitate. They warned me, but I shrugged off those warnings. I needed the money. The instructions were simple. I would meet Barrett in the industrial district where he would be waiting with the cargo already packed in the truck. The drive would take about 2 days, but it was a straight shot through the steppe. Nothing too difficult. Naturally, I was not made privy to what my cargo would be. The less I knew, the better, or so I thought. The cold winter sun had barely risen by the time I arrived at the meeting point. My colleagues had described Barrett as a lean man with messy black hair and a lazy eye. Though there was a truck that matched the specifications of my ride, the scientist was nowhere to be found. Out by the pumps stood 4 identical giants with shaved heads and earpieces and rifles. Behind the plexiglass of the gas station stood a sole nervous clerk. The armed men ignored the anxious teen. They all stared at me with dumb expressions void of all meaning. "You're here." Dr. Barrett walked up behind me, stubbing out his cigarette. He was just as my colleagues had described him, yet he looked a lot more exhausted than I expected him to be. Dark rings around his eyes gave him the look of a raccoon. The disheveled lab coat with coffee stains only amplified the appearance. "You're going to have questions. Don't ask them," he said, ushering me to the truck. "You'll be riding with one of our guards. Don't worry. We're not expecting anyone to interfere. They're mainly here to make sure you won't get any ideas, which you hopefully won't." As we walked, he reached for another smoke. He waved the cigarette towards the 4 armed men and whirled it in the air like a conductor. The obedient symphony split. One of the guards climbed into the cabin of the truck. The other climbed into a dark blue Chargan parked nearby. "Don't try to talk to the guard," Barrett said as we approached the truck. He put the cigarette in his mouth to light it, but then thought better of the pumps. "He's not a big conversationalist, not a rule, just a suggestion. Not asking questions is the rule." The trailer on the truck was touched with rust. Its doors seemed to be held together with chewing gum and hope. I had my concerns about the cargo falling out on the road, but Dr. Barrett didn't seem like a man who would appreciate interruption. "We'll be driving up front. I have business at the facility we are transferring the cargo to. The guards are just here to ensure the goods get delivered. Hopefully you got your beauty sleep. Tanker's full. Won't be stopping to refuel till the evening, and you'll be driving through the night. There's go pills in the dash if you need them. Cash. Half here, half there," Barrett said, producing a crumpled envelope from his lab coat. "Any questions?" The envelope was heavier than I expected. I shook my head. "Good," he said. Before he got into the driver's seat of the Shagan, he lit up his cigarette. Barrett was right. The bald giant who was riding with me wasn't much of a conversationalist. As I got in the cab, I wished him a good morning and told him my name. He didn't even look at me. The guard just stared on ahead with an expression that suggested little internal monologue. His vague point of focus didn't change until well into the afternoon. Having a rifle in the cab didn't make me comfortable. The strange bald giant not even giving me the courtesy of eye contact made the situation worse. But I got used to it. Once we got out of the city, I turned on some music. Half an hour in, I had forgotten about the guard altogether. I thought that this is what my colleagues warned me about. Mystery cargo in a bad trailer with a potentially unstable armed man. I had never worked under stranger conditions, but the money was worth it. Back then, as the sun was starting to dip down into night, the money seemed worth it. It was still light when I heard the first sounds. Something was shifting around in the trailer. We were in the midst of crawling through some hills. The shuffling sounds persisted, but I just convinced myself that it was the old trailer settling in from the incline. It wasn't until I heard the first gurgle that I turned off the radio. For about a minute I traveled in complete silence. Then the sound returned. A strained, wet sound loud enough to be heard over the engine. I asked the guard if he heard the noise. As expected, he kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut. My mind started to race with possibilities about what could be inside of the trailer. I had never transported something alive. The size of the paycheck started to tug at my imagination. The strange groans persisted, and their origins grew more numerous. As the creatures in the back of the truck continued to gurgle, I tried to place them within the animal kingdom. Cows, perhaps sheep, could make that sort of sound, but I could imagine no livestock that could make groans so deep and loud. It wasn't until the screaming started that I realized I was not dealing with an animal at all. It came with such force and suddenness that I nearly drove the truck into the ditch. The gurgles from the back of the truck rose to a shrill, unignorable degree. The screams were tortured and rabid and defied all known biology. The horrid sounds coming from the trailer were loud enough to catch the attention of the bald giant sitting next to me. Our eyes met. "Do you hear that?" I asked. If the eyes are a window to the soul, the man's mental palace was condemned decades ago. He held my gaze briefly, without expression, and then he grumbled something into his earpiece. He listened. Past the dark screams from the back of the truck, I could hear a voice buzz in his ear. With a nod and another grunt, the bald giant shifted his gaze back to the world beyond the windshield. When I kept looking back at the trailer and trying to make sense of the screeching, he nudged me with the butt of his rifle. The armed man nodded to the road. That's where my attention was meant to be. The sounds coming from the trailer rose and fell as the drive went on, yet they never truly disappeared. My mind jumped from the flimsy doors of the container to the nature of the screaming cargo to the question of my personal safety. I had slept well the night prior, but the screaming from the back of the truck was so intense that I reached for the pills in the dash. I needed to focus. With the amphetamines in my system, time became immaterial. It could have been 15 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. I drove, laser focused on the Chagan driving in front of me, trying to ignore the horror at my back. I was brought out of my upper-induced trance by another push of the guard's rifle. Off in the darkness of the steppe, there shimmered the faint light of a gas station. Judging by the guard's grunts, we were to stop there. I put up no resistance. Bharat got out of the Chagan before I managed to climb out of the cab. With his cigarette, he motioned to the quartet of giants to attend to the truck. "Let them handle the fuel," he said, walking away from the pumps and putting the cigarette in his mouth. It's one of the few things they are proficient at. With my legs weak with horror and my voice trembling with shock, I followed the scientist. I broke the one rule Bharat had clearly stated. I said no questions. His voice was stern, but once he lit his cigarette, he opened up the pack and offered me one. I don't smoke, but the drugs in my system and terror in my soul made me hungry for nicotine. "The less you know, the better," Bharat said, looking off into the endless night of the steppe. "The less you know, the happier you'll be. Take it from me, I know much and I suffer greatly for it." The cigarette didn't soothe my nerves in the slightest. We were standing far enough from the truck for the screams to be muffled, yet even at a distance I could see the trailer rock back and forth with restless movement from the cargo. I demanded to know what I was ferrying across the country. When it became clear to Dr. Bharat that I would not continue my work without answers, he let out a long, tired sigh. "I work for a scientific institution," he said, looking out into the ether, "a research facility that has recently come under certain financial strains. Again, the less you know, the better. But if this institution were to, say, collapse, if the things that were worked on in this institution were to get out into the world..." He shook his head. The quartet of guards stood by the swaying truck, watching us. "We're past the halfway point. By sunrise, we'll stop somewhere safe to sleep. By late afternoon, you'll be a richer man, and you'll never have to think about this drive again." Bharat spared a look to the truck. He scoffed. "I saw the way you looked at the trailer. I concur. It's flimsy. It's flimsy, but what my superiors want, my superiors get. Don't worry, though," he said, when he read the worry on my face. "If any of the cargo gets out, the boys with the guns will take care of it. God knows they're capable of little else." Just as Bharat mentioned our armed escort, they all reached for their earpieces. Something was being said to them. They listened. They listened. And then, with discomforting unison, 3 of the men started to walk towards us. The 4th waited by the trailer, watching it rock from side to side with increasing tenacity. The armed men moving towards us bothered me. They also seemed to bother Bharat, but before he could say anything, his phone rang. "We're past the halfway point," he said into the phone with the slightest hint of deference. "The GH-58s have woken up. I hope they'll go back to resting for the rest of the journey, but please let the people at the new facility know that they might..." "What?" The cigarette fell from Dr. Bharat's lips. "What? You can't be serious." All the respect had faded from his voice. Now he was balancing the edge between fury and fear. "Released. Henry, this is madness. The Institute has kept its secrecy for decades. What could we possibly gain from..." Bharat listened intently to the explanation from his phone. I took a step back. The 3 guards had their rifles raised, and they were far too close for comfort. Seeing their attention focused solely on the disheveled man in the lab coat, I slunk off into the darkness. Bharat continued to argue with the phone as the trio surrounded him. His panic and disbelief rose into shriller and shriller tones until, finally, he was hung up on. That's when Dr. Bharat realized he was surrounded by the guards. That's when he became fully aware of their raised rifles. As he tried to argue with the guards, as he demanded they lower their weapons, I slunk further into the darkness. I knew full well the bald giants weren't conversationalists. I expected them to load him into the car, to maybe rough him up, yet they didn't. As Bharat demanded the guards to leave him be, they raised their hands to their earpieces. They were given the order to shoot. The gunshot sent me diving into the ditch by the road. What followed was a long, strained silence, only accompanied by the far-off inhuman screams from the trailer. Before the crack of the shots fully settled into the night, a voice came from the gas station. I could not hear what it said. After a couple words, it was cut short by another rapport from the rifle. With the looming threat of death and the chemistry floating around my bloodstream, my aim was singular: survival. As silently as I could, I crawled away from the scene of the murder. Through darkness and rocks and cold earth I crawled, until I was sure the men with rifles couldn't see me. It wasn't until I was certain I was hidden by the dark that I raised my head. 3 tall silhouettes stood at the spot where Barrett had been executed. In the fluorescence of the gas station stood the 4th giant, staring off into the ether. Not far from him lay the unmoving body of a gas station attendant. I could no longer hear the screams of my cargo, yet the trailer still rocked from side to side. We were in the middle of the sticks. I had nowhere to run. I was certain that if the armed men saw me again, I would end up just as Barrett or the gas station attendant did. I kept my head low and watched what the giants would do. After lifting his finger to his earpiece, the armed man by the gas station walked over to the Chagan. He took something out of the car and then went to join the trio in the darkness. Beams of light rendered the silhouettes of the giants whole. With little coordination, the 3 men spread out and started to search the steppe with flashlights. They were nowhere near my hiding spot. That soothed my amped-up heart. What calmed me even further was the realization that the Chagan's taillights were on. The keys were still in the car. Seeing a means of escape, I crept my way towards the gas station. Even though the guard who brought the flashlights was returning back to the pumps, I figured I could distract him and try to escape in the Chagan. The guard, however, did not return to his post. Instead, he made his way to the back of the trailer. He reached for the doors, but hesitated. Whatever was in the back of the truck had grown even more restless. The trailer was bouncing from wheel to wheel, shedding rust. The screaming had reached a new, dark tenor that murmured through the night. The giant raised his hand to his earpiece once more. He nodded. It was a moonless night. The fluorescence of the gas station shined like spotlights on a dimmed stage. They hid nothing. What crawled and leaped out of that truck defied all reason. Blobs of flesh, at least 4 meters tall, with short, stubby limbs, huge eyes, almost cartoon-like in their roundness, took up most of the beast's body mass. The rest was taken up by its horrid, screaming mouth. The things swarmed over themselves to escape the truck, stomping on each other's faces, pushing and shoving and screaming. The faint beams from the trio searching the steppe shifted over to the stampede. The 4th guard had disappeared beneath an avalanche of discolored flesh. The screaming abominations ran off in all the cardinal directions. The things were heavy. As I lay on the ground, I could feel their gallop in the earth. The drumbeat of their stumbling limbs got closer and closer until, to my utter horror, one of the creatures fell into the ditch. It landed flat on its face. It screeched into the cold earth with absolute mania. The lumpy creature was stuck. Feeling like I was balancing on the edge of a heart attack, I wanted nothing more but to crawl as far away as I could from the creature. Yet I quickly realized which way the gas station was. The thought of the guards coming to check on the fallen creature steadied my crawl towards it. I loathed the idea of touching that sickly flesh. Yet the Chagan was in one direction and death lay everywhere else. With bated breath and shut eyes, I crawled over the screaming thing. Its warm flesh nearly sent me into a panic, but I pushed on past the fear. My crawl seemed to have dislodged the creature somehow. By the time I was back on the cold earth, the mass of flesh had risen to its stumpy legs. I crawled away from it as quickly as I could. Behind me, the creature ran in the opposite direction. At first it coughed on the raw earth and stone it had swallowed, but it quickly resumed its terrible scream. By the time I had followed the ditch to the gas station, the screams were mere echoes in the plain of night. When I peeked out of my hole, I was further relieved to see the guard had not gotten up. The beams of the searching trio had gone back to searching the night. They were all moving in unison deeper into the steppe. I took my opportunity and crept towards the Chagan. The gas station clerk was dead, undeniably so. A messy patch of dents stretched across his upper chest, and his eyes were rolled back in his skull. The adrenaline spared me most of the horror of the sight, but when I saw the guard, I could scarcely hold my balance. He was fine. The bald giant was laying on his back, looking up at the blinding fluorescence. He was blinking. He was alive and seemed fairly content. When I saw that the keys were indeed still inside of the Chagan, I considered returning back to Barrett's body and retrieving the rest of my payment. The searching trio was far gone into the steppe, and the guard on his back didn't seem particularly alert. I considered going back to Barrett's body and getting my cash, but then I realized it was the go-pills talking. Thanking all that is holy, I climbed into the Chagan and drove off. When I started to back up, the giant that was laying on the floor slowly rose. By the time I was on the main road, he had his hand on the rifle, but he didn't shoot. The gas station quickly became lost in my rearview mirror. Briefly, just as my heart rate started to settle, I saw one of those monstrosities running next to the road. Luckily, my headlights scared it off. Soon enough, it disappeared into the darkness, hopefully never to be seen again. I got rid of the Chagan in the nearest city and retreated back home. There's little that could connect me to the job, and I pray the armed escort lacks the mental capacity to remember me, let alone describe me. Next time I see my colleagues, those that with such warning put me in touch with Dr. Barrett, I'll tell them they were right to warn me. I've driven trucks for most of my life, but no cargo has been as haunting as the one I drove for Dr. Barrett. I knew I had made it home as soon as I merged onto I-24 East. I ran through a minefield of potholes deep and wide, the dilapidated road scraping and banging against the bottom of my car, and then an abrupt stop as traffic came to an infuriating standstill, an insulting barrier to my way home. I-24, the bane of my existence. It's never clear, even on a Sunday evening. There's constant construction, but never any improvement. I hate that damn highway. They say Nashvillians are a congenial people, but we sure as shit can't drive. The roads are bad enough, but the people driving on those roads are worse. Potholes are somewhat beneficial since they act as speed bumps, yet even those don't have much effect. They drive as if they're in well-armored, souped-up Humvees. I was for sure that's what was impeding my progress this time as well. Bumper to bumper, because some moron had lost control and flipped his car, probably weaving in and out of traffic. Now these days, it's not good enough to be in the slow lane. They push you out of the slow lane as if you were cramming up the fast lane. Or maybe it was a crotch rocket splashed all over the side of a big rig because some dumb punk tried to squeeze in between two 18-wheelers. I imagined all kinds of scenarios, every one of them angering me to no end. I was tired and irritable, a 10-hour drive and too many energy drinks. I was full of piss and caffeine, not at all in the mood to sit in traffic whiffing exhaust and burnt rubber. I was stuck behind an SUV with a sticker of Jesus' head on one side of the window and Our Lady of Guadalupe on the other. Somewhere trapped in this sea of vehicles were at least 3 screeching banshees, teenage-owned cars equipped with specialty pipes made to backfire, crackle and explode. My GPS showed a bold red line from the bottom to the top of the screen, less than 20 miles from home, but more than an hour to go. There was a competition between the 3 for our entertainment to see who could make their exhaust more obnoxious. More than 30 minutes and I was bound to lose my mind. The line began to move, the swell inched forward. It was enough space for the car behind me to pull around on the shoulder of the road and jump in front of me. It was an asinine move that gave him hardly any more advantage than he already had. I felt blood rush to my head. I grinded my teeth and clinched the steering wheel as if to crush it with my bare hands. "You stupid motherfucker!" I yelled, and not just once, but over and over again, banging my fists against the steering wheel as I did so. Pipes backfired, horns honked, brakes squealed, drivers cussed. Mayhem enveloped the highway. The GPS now mockingly flashed 2 more hours until I would get home. Time was going backwards, and I wasn't making any headway. The car in front of me darted into the left lane. Appreciative of the driver's foray into futility, I quickly resumed my position behind the SUV. Jesus looked into heaven, oblivious to the world around, but Mary looked frustrated, forced to stare down, to look at the fullness of insanity. Traffic began to roll forward. My car dipped forward as it fell into yet another pothole. I cringed at the sound of the bottom of my car scraping against the road. "Fuck you!" I yelled. I heard a muffled "fuck you" in another car beside me and a childish chuckle. A young boy was laughing into his hands. His mother reached back and slapped him across the head. "Roll up that window," she demanded as she gave me a chiding glance. Mary didn't seem too pleased with me either. I told myself I needed to relax. There was nothing I could do, but even the thought of that angered me. 30 minutes ticked away with no movement at all. I wanted to get out of the car to stretch my legs and possibly see what was happening. I opened the door and unfastened my seatbelt. The smell of sulfur immediately stung my nose and throat. In the distance, a plume of yellow smoke began to rise up into the air. I walked away from the car to the shoulder of the road. I could hear a ruckus of people screaming and cars crashing. The plume of smoke grew thicker and fanned out into a myriad of tendrils across the expanse of the sky. It shot beyond where I was standing and stood still in the air for a moment, and then there was an explosion. Yellow dust slowly descended to the highway. I started to make my way back to the car, but I had waited too long. The dust had nearly reached the ground. I didn't have any time to get to the shelter and safety of my car. No need, though. The dust was falling only on the highway. I was safe on the shoulder of the road, but to be even more cautious, I moved up onto the hill near the barrier. The dust didn't settle on the exterior of the cars, but passed right on through and into the ground except for when it encountered people. When it landed on people, it was immediately absorbed, so much so that it was visible as an aura around each person. There was the dust, and then a void around the person that was absorbing the dust. Something maddening was in the dust, for when it was absorbed, people lost their minds. They would shake their heads violently and slobber at the mouth. Every passing glance was an occasion for a fight. Drivers used their vehicles as weapons. Cars were banging into the backs of other cars. A driver further down pulled onto the shoulder of the road and accelerated to a high speed, then slightly pulled the car back towards the road, knocking off mirrors and scraping exteriors until finally a flatbed truck pulled out in front of it. The car smashed into the side of the trailer. The roof partially peeled back, and there was a splatter of blood that shot out of the side of the car. The tail end lifted into the air, swung to the right, and then slammed to the ground. If what existed before was gridlock, then this was the absolute cessation of all mechanical motion. Every car was either locked in place by another car or totaled by the confluence of high velocity. Whatever the case, none escaped. Now the madness spilled out of the cars. There was a general melee falling like dominoes down the highway, men and women beating each other, kicking and biting, doing whatever they needed to do to cause their fellow human beings to suffer. I saw the boy who earlier had mimicked me. His mother laid on her back, unconscious, while her son repeatedly kicked her in the head. The father was too busy pounding another man's head into the street. A horrible thought popped into my head. I wondered if the father wasn't preoccupied with attempted homicide. Would he stop his son or help him? Maybe it was he that knocked her out in the first place. His son was just mopping up. "Hey, you piece of shit!" A burly man, far bigger than me, had spotted me up on the embankment. He was wearing his anger in every aspect of his mannerisms. His fists were balled up and arms swinging erratically. He was breathing fast and hard, face red, stomping up towards me like a bull after a matador. Yet, as soon as he stepped off the road and into the grass, everything about him changed. He loosened up his fists and relaxed. He had a bewildered look on his face and was genuinely confused about where he was at. He looked behind him and was overwhelmed with shock. "What's going on?" he asked as he ran up to me. "I don't know. Everyone has gone crazy. Look at that kid. I've got to stop him." I grabbed him by the arm. "I don't think you should go back in there. Maybe we can lure him out." There was another explosion in the sky as I carefully approached the road, gauging the boundary between war and peace. "Hey, you little shit. Look at me, you filthy little turd." The child ignored me, ever focused on kicking his mom. I gathered a handful of pebbles and started throwing them. Most of my early attempts were wide left and didn't get much better from there. It had been a while since I had thrown anything, and my new buddy grew impatient with my lack of athleticism. He stepped up beside me and in the most perfect form launched a pebble that hit the young boy square in the jaw. The boy stumbled a bit, but then without hesitation ran towards us. His eyes were a dark yellow with small black pupils. He made a beastly growl as he made his way across the road and through the carnage. We backed away to give him plenty of room to run through. The boy barreled through the invisible field, stumbling to his knees as he came off the road. He began bawling, putting his hands to his temples. My head hurts, he cried out. Come here, son. What's your dad's name? Where's Mummy? Dead. And you've been kicking the shit out of her for 30 minutes. She's at home. What's your dad's name? Richard, my head, it hurts so bad. My partner approached me. Which one is he? You can't throw worth a shit. I think it's the guy in the red t-shirt. Take care of the boy. I'll get his dad. He stuck out his hand. My name's Tom. I shook his hand. Dave. He looked appreciative, as if I had saved his life. All I had done was accidentally lured him out of the water like a worm on a hook. I guess sometimes, in rare circumstances, being a spineless worm is enough to be a hero. Yet, I felt guilty because I believe he assumed that what I had tried to do for the kid I had done for him. Some things are best left unexplained. I picked up the boy and carried him to the barrier. Tom was efficient. Each and every pebble he threw hit its mark. But the boy's father was determined to finish off he poor fellow he was on top of, his fists bloody and torn from overuse. Finally, Tom hurled a larger rock, smacking the man in the side of the head. Come on, Richard. Come get you some. That's right, Tom said as he got into a boxer's stance. Tom had snagged him, the bait taken. Richard got up and sprinted toward the side of the road, hungry for another fight. The same as before, as soon as Richard got off the road, he fell into a stupor, grabbed his head and fell to the ground. He groaned and rolled over to his stomach. My head. It's about to explode. Where's Carol? Brett? I saw Tom put his arms around his shoulder and whisper in his ear. Richard broke down and wept. The boy had not noticed his father. He was in pain, complaining that there was a loud ringing in his ears. I felt everyone was poisoned and that the longer they were in, the more likely they were to die. Richard stood up and stared into the chaos. He started to walk back towards the road, but Tom grabbed him. A struggle ensued and Tom slammed Richard to the ground. Help, Dave, I need help! I left the boy and ran down and sat on Richard's legs. Tom was laying across his chest and squeezing Richard in a headlock, trying to talk sense into him. You can't go back out there, you'll lose it. I can't leave her out there, it's not right. We'll get her later when all this clears. When what clears? What is it? What in the hell is it? What was what? That was a good question. The one column had now split into two columns. The explosions became more frequent. The madness expanded. Richard eventually calmed down. He knew that Tom was correct, that going back out there was a bad idea. The boy was reunited with his father. Nothing was said of his mother. We walked our way up the highway, hugging the barrier, until it ended, making our way closer to the source. Our numbers grew as time passed, for often someone would see us, charge, and then break through the insanity. After a short rest, and a tentative explanation, we would resume our voyage. The fighting further up the highway was now sluggish. People had worn themselves out, but were still unwilling to stop. Their efforts were pitiful, but their spite was far from weakening. Some were on their knees, slapping at their opponents. Others were simply lying on their backs, verbally harassing whoever they saw. A good deal of them were deceased. Finally, after an hour of walking, we made it to the source. In the middle of the highway was a large sinkhole, extending across the width of the road. Deep from within the hole, a wide column of yellow smoke, churning like a tornado, rose high into the sky. Lightning and fire shot out from the sides. The rumble of thunder shook the ground, and there was a continuous loud shrill piercing the air. The column forked and became two near the top, and folded over and extended down the highway, exploding ever so often and dousing the highway below. Oddly, the width of the column equaled exactly the width of the eastbound lanes. The ground and cars near the perimeter of the hole were on fire. On the other side of the column and in the westbound lane were a convoy of black sedans, black vans, and black semi-trucks. There was a command center with trailers and tents set up to the side of the highway where we were headed. The fire trucks and the police cars were kept at bay. The convoy was blocking their path and not letting them through. I don't feel too comfortable staying on this course, Tom confided in me. I don't think they are there to help us. I agreed. Tom and I, along with Richard and Brett, made a detour and went perpendicular to the highway and walked through an adjacent field. None of the others followed. We watched from a distance as they were rounded up and herded into one of several trailers. After some time, we separated and went our own ways. It was a long walk home, but one I appreciated. I felt sure that the feds were waiting at my house, and I wasn't in any hurry to be apprehended and liquidated. When I got close to home, I snuck around to my neighbor's yard across the street and watched for a while. When I was sure no one was waiting on me or spying outside my house, I made my way to the front door. I put the key in and was waiting for someone to grab me. Nothing. I turned the key and went inside. Safe. The house was empty. I didn't even undress. I stumbled to my bed and immediately fell asleep. The next day, Metro Police called and said that they had my car. They explained that it was probably totaled and best to call my insurance. Months passed and no one has harassed me. No one has accosted me and threw me in a room and interrogated me for hours. I suspect they're watching me, though. They're seeing what happens, waiting in the shadows, biding their time. Are there any lingering effects? How did he escape the mayhem? Why isn't he affected? Just pure luck, boys. Stepping away at exactly the right time. This worm wiggled and squirmed and accidentally survived. The news said it was a massive gas leak and that it hindered visibility for miles. This resulted in a 10-mile pileup. I guess the violent behavior was due to frustration. They didn't speak much to that. After all, I-24 is nothing but potholes and assholes. That's enough to drive anyone mad, and not really news at all. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.